Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Tales of the Unexpected, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story begins on a sunny day in a seaside resort where an old gentleman visiting from the south walked over and asked if he could sit here. Roald, his longtime buddy, warmly invited him to join. The gentleman sat down and started looking for a topic to chat about. Gazing into the distance, he remarked that youth is such a wonderful thing. Just look at those young people, so full of life. Roald agreed, saying they must be tourists, and not far from here there's a medical rescue team stationed nearby to ensure their safety. After some fun in the water, a young man named Tommy invited a girl named Kathy to grab a drink together. While they were playing water volleyball earlier, there had been a bit of physical contact and Kathy had developed a slight interest in him. She agreed, and the two made their way to a pavilion. Politely, they asked if they could sit down before joining the gentleman and Roald at their table. Tommy, eager to make a good impression, quickly lit up a cigarette and started offering it to everyone. Seeing that the gentleman had his own cigar, Tommy reached for his lighter to help light it. But the gentleman casually commented on his lighter that it doesn't seem very reliable. Tommy protested, saying it's impossible since this lighter is American-made. It works every single time. The gentleman raised an eyebrow, asking if he was sure about that and if this lighter never fails. Once again, Tommy responded that it works every time. The gentleman leaned in with a challenge, asking him to prove it or if he was willing to bet on it. Tommy, brimming with confidence, accepted his challenge. The gentleman was convinced that Tommy's lighter couldn't possibly light successfully every time, so he proposed a bet. If Tommy could get the lighter to ignite 10 times in a row, the gentleman would give him his car. However, if even one attempt failed, Tommy would have to chop off his left pinky finger and give it to the gentleman. Hearing this bizarre wager, Tommy reacted like anyone else would, wondering why the man would want his pinky rather than his muscles or smelly sausage. Naturally, Tommy wasn't too eager, but the gentleman, with absolute confidence in his car's value, insisted that if he can just manage to light it 10 times in a row, the car is his. Hesitant, Tommy finally asked to see the car first, so the four of them headed over to where the gentleman had parked. To be honest, the moment Tommy laid eyes on it, he fell in love. The white four-seater car was exactly what he had been dreaming of. Like many recent graduates, he didn't have much money and couldn't afford one himself. He climbed inside for a quick test sit, and his heart was set. He thought it's just a bet, and the odds are in his favor, and if he loses, he'll go straight to the hospital to reattach the finger. And so, all four of them went to the gentleman's hotel room. Along the way, both Kathy and Roald tried their best to dissuade Tommy from taking the bet. But at the same time, curiosity got the better of them. They wanted to see how it all played out. Once they were in the room, the gentleman called room service and asked for a hammer, a knife, and a few nails. Without hesitation, he expertly fixed Tommy's left hand onto the table, binding it with rope so only the pinky was exposed, making it convenient for the knife to do its job. Judging by the gentleman's practiced manner, it seemed like this wasn't his first time making such a bet. With Kathy unable to convince Tommy otherwise, Roald decided to step in as the referee. The game began, and Tommy started flicking his lighter. The gentleman stood nearby, holding a knife in his left hand, poised over Tommy's fingers. The room suddenly turned tense. With a flick, Tommy lit the lighter for the first time. A quick adjustment later, Tommy flicked again, and Roald counted the number. Slowing down a bit, Tommy successfully lit the lighter again. After the third time, Kathy began to sweat nervously on Tommy's behalf, while the gentleman remained calm and serious. Thankfully, Tommy managed to light it 2 more times, successfully reaching 5. By this point, they had hit a critical moment. Kathy, however, couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed Tommy's hand, pleading anxiously for him to stop since it's not worth it. Seeing Tommy's determination, she threatened to leave if he didn't stop. And then came the twist. Just as Tommy was about to attempt the 6th flick, a middle-aged woman burst into the room. Taking in the scene, she stormed over, snatched the knife from the gentleman, and put an end to the bet. Kathy rushed over with a pair of scissors, cutting the rope binding Tommy's hand. The woman, furious, began yelling in rapid-fire native language before switching to English to explain the situation to the group. She revealed that she was the gentleman's wife. As it turned out, the gentleman had a strange obsession with gambling, particularly betting on people's pinky fingers. He had already lost 11 cars in 47 similar bets. She asked Tommy if her husband is betting him for a car this time. Tommy nodded sheepishly, and the woman continued, saying, "That car isn't even his, it's hers." With the truth out, Ralston handed the car keys back to the woman. Hearing the gentleman mumble about it being just a small bet, she scolds him even further, saying they've gambled their entire lives and he always loses, holding up her left hand to reveal 2 missing fingers. So, what happened between the gentleman and his wife before all this? Well, that's a story for another time. The second story begins with Mr. Bixby watching his wife pack her suitcase. Teasing her, he asked what's with all the luggage and if she was sure of moving out for 3 months. Miss Bixby smiled and replied that she was just visiting an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She would be back in 2 weeks. Turning off the lights, she climbed into bed. Mr. Bixby muttered again why he couldn't come along if it's an old friend. Miss Bixby answered curtly that it's not convenient. The next morning, with Mr. Bixby off to work, Miss Bixby was in high spirits. She put on her favorite lipstick and got dressed, looking her best. After all, as the saying goes, a woman dresses up for the one who admires her. But Miss Bixby wasn't heading off to see any old friend. She was about to meet her longtime lover, the Colonel. Every few months, Miss Bixby carved out time to catch up with the Colonel. Fresh off her flight, she climbed into his car, and the two immediately kissed without using a tongue condom. What followed was a week of passion. Neither Miss Bixby nor the Colonel went anywhere. They stayed home, making up for lost time. By the end of it, both were thoroughly exhausted. One morning, the Colonel woke Miss Bixby gently, saying it's time for her old body to go. He had arranged a driver to take her to the airport. Though Miss Bixby felt a bit unfulfilled, she reluctantly packed her things. At the airport, the driver handed her a gift from the Colonel, a final token of their time together. Eagerly, Miss Bixby opened the package in the airport lounge. Inside was a stunning, elegant black coat. She was so moved she nearly cried, thinking that he always knows her best. So she tried it on immediately. Admiring herself in the mirror, Miss Bixby felt like the queen of the underworld. The coat oozed power and style. But then she found a note tucked inside the box. The Colonel's message read, "This past week was their farewell. She had her family, and he had his. These secret meetings every few months couldn't go on forever, so they had to end things while they're still good, and this coat is his final gift to her." Miss Bixby felt a twinge of sadness. While she was disappointed their affair was over, she figured at least she got a fabulous coat out of it. But now, she had a new problem. How was she going to explain this coat to her husband? On her way to catch a taxi, Miss Bixby spotted a pawn shop and had a sudden crazy idea. She went in and explained to the owner that she had lost her wallet and she wouldn't be able to pay the taxi driver. She asked him how much he could offer for her coat. The owner immediately offered her $50, took the coat, and started to write down the details for the transaction. Miss Bixby then slowed her speech and asked him not to write down where the coat came from or her personal information, but just put down household items instead, and she will come back tomorrow morning with the receipt to redeem the coat. After some back and forth, the owner reluctantly agreed, took the coat, and handed Miss Bixby $50. That night, Miss Bixby shared an elaborate story with her husband, inventing a tale about her and her old friend's vacation. Feeling that the timing was just right, she pulled out a receipt card for the coat, claiming she had found it in the backseat of a taxi. Excitedly, Miss Bixby called her husband over, asking if this was a lottery ticket or what. Mr. Bixby took a closer look and concluded, saying it looks like a pawn shop receipt or some kind of ticket. With $50, she can redeem something. Miss Bixby, knowing her husband's love for bargains and surprises, orchestrated the whole act perfectly. She wanted him to redeem the coat and present it to her as a gift, thus hiding the truth of her affair while also legitimizing her possession of the coat. Thrilled by the receipt, the man began imagining what the 50 item could be. He was convinced it would be a steal. Playing along, Miss Bixby said she would join him to redeem it the next day. However, Mr. Bixby insisted no need for that. He'll go alone. When he brings it back, he'll surprise her. Miss Bixby made him promise her that the first thing he would do is let her know what's inside. The following morning, Mr. Bixby took the receipt and went straight to the pawn shop to redeem the coat. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until Miss Bixby received a call from Mr. Bixby while she was at home. Playing dumb, she acted surprised and said she would come over right now to take a look. Miss Bixby arrived at her husband's workplace. After being welcomed by his secretary, she was led into his office. Mr. Bixby, looking mysterious, asked his wife to close her eyes for the surprise. Smiling, Miss Bixby complied, but when she opened her eyes a few seconds later, she was stunned. Standing before her wasn't the coat, but a scarf. Mr. Bixby beamed with pride, telling her the color suits her and he bets this material is worth at least $300, so they totally lucked out. As he spoke, Mr. Bixby walked over and gently wrapped the scarf around her neck, proudly declaring it an early Christmas present. Mr. Bixby continued, saying, "The clinic is quite busy today. He probably won't make it home for dinner tonight. He'll be back around 9. With that, Miss Bixby left the office feeling utterly disappointed. Love, gifts, these things often hold the deepest meaning for a woman. But Miss Bixby hadn't anticipated this outcome. Where was the coat? She mulled it over in confusion. As she stepped into the elevator, she spotted her husband's secretary, who smiled warmly at her. But Miss Bixby's gaze immediately fell on the coat the secretary was wearing, the very coat she had her eyes on. In that instant, everything clicked. The secretary was the one Mr. Bixby had planned to meet later that evening, and it was clear the two had something smelly and fishy going on. The third story begins with an old man, William, passing away after a long illness. His wife, Mary, went to the hospital to handle the paperwork for his remains and eventually attended the burial. But as the pastor delivered his eulogy at the grave, Mary couldn't shake an eerie feeling. It was as though William wasn't really gone. She felt like his invisible eyes were watching her from somewhere, and the pastor's words seemed to carry an unusual weight. The next morning, when Mary met with William's lawyer, her unease had only grown. Sitting across from him, she opened with a sarcastic remark that if her husband is not done with her yet. The lawyer, calm and composed with his bald head, replied that he served as William's legal counsel since his days as a professor at the university. They had known each other well, so he would get straight to the point. He opened a sealed letter from William and began reading its contents. In the letter, William wished for his wife to meet with Dr. Randy, and he has a gift for her. The lawyer paused and clarified that Dr. Randy had been William's primary physician, though Mary hadn't had much interaction with him. Feeling obligated to honor her husband's last wish, Mary agreed. Later that afternoon, with the lawyer facilitating the introduction, Mary arrived at the hospital and met Dr. Randy. Once the lawyer stepped out, Mary sat down and bluntly asked why her husband wanted her to meet him. At first, the story seemed like it might be a ghost tale, but as Dr. Randy and Mary engaged in a back-and-forth conversation, the truth gradually emerged. It turned out that Randy wasn't just an ordinary doctor. His main focus was studying the human brain. About a month ago, when William was nearing death, he voluntarily agreed to participate in Randy's groundbreaking project on brain immortality. Hearing this, Mary became visibly serious and shared her feelings. She said in these past few days, she had this strange sense that her husband isn't really gone. It feels like he's watching her from somewhere she can't see. Randy handed Mary a cigarette and lit it for her, trying to ease the tension. Then he hinted that her husband William isn't actually dead. Mary was skeptical, claiming that was impossible and he was at the burial too. They all saw him being laid to rest. Randy glanced in the direction of the adjacent room and calmly said, "William is right next door." Mary was so stunned by this revelation that she had to take a sip of water to steady herself, asking to see her husband with her own eyes. Randy, realizing this needed a more detailed explanation, closed the curtains, dimmed the lights, and started a slideshow presentation. He then showed the footage from one of their earlier experiments. The slides showed a dog that had died. Using specialized electrodes, they reconnected and reactivated the dog's brain. Although the dog's body remained lifeless, the brain was able to function, sending signals through neural connections to various devices. Mary, growing emotional, challenged him if he had turned her shitty husband into a dog. Randy quickly clarified that back then, they thought if they could reactivate a dog's brain and keep it alive, why couldn't we do the same with a human brain? Mary grew suspicious, afraid that they might cut off William's head for this. Randy explained that William had voluntarily signed up for the project, and both parties had agreed to it in a legal contract. Mary struggled to believe it. Her husband was an intelligent professor. How could he willingly give up his brain? After much explanation and reassurance, Mary calmed down and began to understand. Randy finally offered to show her the adjacent room so she could see William herself. Standing by the doorway, Randy continued to explain that this metallic box contains William's brain. It's now fully reactivated. The right side is connected to an artificial heart, and through this device's artificial eyes, William can currently see the ceiling above him. Mary looked up at the ceiling and asked if he would get tired of staring at that, since William always preferred watching TV series from Daniel CC Movie Channel. Randy invited Mary to step closer, allowing William to take a look at her. Mary walked over and looked directly into the artificial eyes on the metallic box. She asked if her husband still recognized her. The heart monitor attached to the device suddenly spiked, and Randy confirmed that William recognized her and was excited to see her. Mary, still processing everything, asked why her husband couldn't speak if he was still alive and could feel everything. Randy admitted that speech wasn't possible for now. No wonder Mary had felt like William was watching her. His brain was still alive, and she must have sensed it subconsciously. As Mary spoke to William, she gradually went from initial shock to acceptance. She said this actually wasn't so bad. At least she could still feel his presence or some sort of connection. She smiled as she reminisced about their life together, their decision not to have children, and the quirky moments they'd shared. Then Mary asked Dr. Randy when she could take William home. Randy shook his head firmly, saying, "This is an experimental project, and William signed a contract with them. She can't just take his brain, and besides, the equipment in this room is too complex to move." But Mary was equally firm. She reasons that a living brain is still a living person. William is still her husband. If they don't let her take him home, she'll take them to court. In the end, Mary took William's brain back home, along with all the accompanying lab equipment. Over time, Mary adapted to living with her husband's brain, even though he couldn't speak or move. As the days passed, she began to feel more at ease, and even a bit playful. That evening, after drinking heavily, Mary let loose, venting her emotions. She asked William if he was enjoying this atmosphere and told him not to lecture her about drinking and smoking less. She swirled her wine glass and continued teasing. She asked if her dress sparking his desires and told him not to get too excited since she could see his heart monitor spiking. If he had got something to say, just say it. She doesn't even know what he's thinking. She is stuck guessing based on this machine. She continued to annoy him by talking bullshit. At last, she laughed maniacally, saying this isn't so bad for him being like this. She then apologized about the cigarette smoke. She guesses that's bothering him too. And with that, Mary leaned back, gazing at the artificial eyes on the metallic box, feeling both a strange comfort and a bittersweet ache. The fourth story begins in the evening when a woman named Mary returned home excitedly after grocery shopping. She called out to her husband if he was home from work. The shopkeeper picked out the freshest vegetables for her and she would start cooking right away. But as she hung up her coat and stepped into the living room, she froze in shock. Her husband, Patrick, was lying on the floor. She rushed over to check on him only to find he wasn't breathing. He was gone. Patrick wasn't just her husband. He was also the deputy chief of the town's police department. Sobbing uncontrollably, Mary grabbed her phone and called one of Patrick's colleagues, a detective. The detective quickly arrived with his team. Examining the scene, the detective checked Patrick's vital signs while one of his colleagues pulled back the curtains. It was clear that there were no signs of forced entry, so the team began searching other areas of the house. When the detective stood up and confirmed Patrick's death for the second time, Mary was in hysterics. The detective gently led her to the kitchen and sat her down to calm her sexy body. Mary, still crying like a giant baby with crocodile tears, gripped the detective's hand tightly, struggling to hold herself together. The shock of everything, losing her husband so suddenly, had overwhelmed her both physically and emotionally. Trying to console her, the detective reassured her in the way including both his words and muscles. Then, he gently asked Mary to recount exactly what had happened. Mary took a deep breath, her hands limp, her head lowered, as she tried to pull herself together. About an hour and a half ago, around 5:15 p.m., she was knitting and keeping an eye on the clock. She thought Patrick should be home soon. Then she heard the door. She got up to check, and sure enough, it was Patrick. She greeted him as usual. She knew her husband likes a drink after work. His job is stressful, so she poured him some wine and tried to make conversation. But it was clear he wasn't in the mood. He barely responded to anything she said. She figured he might have had a tough day, so she decided to go out and buy groceries to give him some space. The detective nodded, piecing the timeline together. Mary continued, saying when she came back at 6 p.m., she found him lying on the floor like a dead pig. In the living room, the medical examiner and the detective's team were busy inspecting Patrick's body. The medical examiner concluded that Patrick had been struck on the back of the head with a heavy object which killed him instantly. However, despite an extensive search, the team couldn't locate the murder weapon. Frustrated, the detective lost his composure. He told his men to keep looking since the weapon has to be here somewhere. With no immediate leads, the detective sent his assistant to question the grocery store owner for any potential information. The shopkeeper confirmed that Mary had indeed come to the store around 5:30 p.m. to buy vegetables. When the assistant returned with this information, the team was preparing to transport Patrick's body. Seeing this, Mary broke down again, crying hysterically and insisting that they couldn't take her husband away. The detective had no choice but to calm her down once more. As the hours passed, it was now 9 p.m. when Mary suddenly remembered that she had left a leg of lamb in the oven. The detective reassured her it's all right because she can eat it later when she feels ready. But Mary replied that she can't possibly eat such a big lamb by herself. It's too huge. She then proposed to share it with his team who had all been working so hard. Reluctantly, the detective and 3 of his colleagues agreed. They retrieved the roasted leg of lamb from the oven, sat around the table, and began eating. As they ate, they couldn't help but compliment how perfectly seasoned and delicious the lamb was. Meanwhile, Mary sat nearby, listening to their casual conversation. She quietly removed her glasses and allowed a subtle smile to cross her lips. And then came the twist. Mary wasn't entirely innocent. Let's rewind to around 5:20 p.m. Mary's account of Patrick coming home from work was accurate. She wasn't lying. Patrick did return home after work, but no matter how much Mary tried to engage him in conversation, he remained distracted and distant. Eventually, as Mary gently pressed him for what was on his mind, Patrick suddenly stood up, his expression serious, and blurted out that he had been cheating on her. For the past 4 months, whenever he said he was working late or had a meeting, he was actually with his mistress she knew. They had been meeting at a hotel. Mary's eyes widened in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She wondered how the husband she waited for every day, preparing meals and creating a loving home, could betray her like this, and what the mistress had that she didn't. These thoughts raced through her mind, but outwardly, Mary remained silent. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to Patrick's dominant personality. Patrick, on the other hand, seemed to have had his moment of conscience. He assured her that he realized his mistake and asked Mary not to cause a scene or report him. He didn't want anything to ruin his career or reputation. He urged her to keep the peace for the sake of their family and their marriage. Mary simply replied she would go make dinner and quietly walked to the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. Once in the kitchen, Mary opened the freezer and pulled out a leg of lamb that was frozen solid, as hard as a brick. As she looked at the leg of lamb, her anger boiled over. Consumed by rage, Mary made a decision. Gripping the frozen leg of lamb tightly, she stormed back into the living room. Without a word, she crept up behind Patrick and struck him hard on the back of the head, causing him to collapse instantly. Mary stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, staring at his lifeless body. Then she walked to the mirror, took a deep breath, and began rehearsing her story. She collected herself, smoothed her hair, and set the stage for everything that would unfold. The story she would tell the detective, the act she would perform. Mary had killed her husband, and now she was playing the grieving widow. And here's the twist. The leg of lamb, the murder weapon, had been roasted to perfection and served to the detective and his colleagues. They had devoured it down to the bone, leaving no evidence behind. What's more, Mary was familiar with the detective and his team. She had built a friendly rapport with them over the years. Now, with no murder weapon and her connections to the police, it seemed increasingly likely that Mary might just get away with it. The 5th story begins with a young man named Billy who was on a train to London. To pass the time, he struck up a conversation with a stranger sitting across from him. Billy enthusiastically shared his reason for traveling to London. He had an interview with an insurance company. Though he was excited, he wasn't overly worried about the outcome. Billy said cheerfully that even if he didn't get the job, he would treat this trip as a little vacation. He loves traveling anyway. The stranger smiled and nodded approvingly, saying insurance is a solid industry. If it works out, that's fantastic. The two chatted easily for the rest of the journey. By the time they arrived in London, they had formed a casual camaraderie. As they stepped off the train, the stranger, who was a London local, offered Billy some helpful advice about where to stay. Sensing that Billy was looking for an affordable place, the man thought for a moment before suggesting that there's a little place nearby called the Double B. It's run by a friendly landlady and it's both cheap and cozy. Grateful for the recommendation, Billy thanked him and the two parted ways. As Billy walked toward the direction the stranger had pointed out, he reflected on how kind people could be. After wandering for a couple of blocks, he spotted a small sign hanging in the window of a building. The name on the sign caught his attention, Double B. He froze for a moment, surprised by the coincidence. The name Double B was short for bed and breakfast. It sounded simple and inviting, a place where you could rest for the night and enjoy a hearty breakfast in the morning. It seemed perfect for a traveler on a budget. After some hesitation, Billy decided to take it as a sign of fate and walked up to the door. He rang the doorbell, and almost immediately the landlady opened the door. Her sudden appearance startled him, but before Billy could even introduce himself, the landlady launched into a well-rehearsed, welcoming spiel, clearly refined over decades of running her business. The landlady warmly invited Billy inside. As he stepped through the door and shut it behind him, she immediately started her pitch. Before Billy could even ask any questions, she enthusiastically explained that it's only £4 a night, and that includes breakfast. He won't find a cheaper place around here. To be fair, Billy had done some research before coming to London, and she wasn't lying. Most places in the area cost anywhere from £8 to £16 a night. Deciding to stay, he figured this was a good deal. The landlady was friendly, and the place came recommended by the man on the train. When Billy went upstairs to see the room, he was pleasantly surprised. For £4, it was practically a steal. If there was anything to complain about, it might be the landlady's overwhelming enthusiasm. For someone like Billy, who was a little socially anxious, her overly friendly demeanor felt just a touch invasive. She insisted on showing him every detail of the room and stood uncomfortably close while talking. So close, in fact, that Billy had the odd feeling she might lean in and kiss him at any moment. The thought made him shudder. To escape her attention, he quickly came up with an excuse, saying he was not hungry and he didn't need dinner. Since he would have an interview tomorrow morning, he was just going to shower and go straight to bed. Hearing this, the landlady nodded understandingly and moved toward the door. But before leaving, she reminded him firmly that before he goes to sleep, he needs to come downstairs and register his information. It's the law, and if the police come by and she doesn't have it, they'll both get in trouble. After lying down for a short while, Billy made his way downstairs to fill out the registration book. As he signed his name, his eyes wandered over the previous entries. Two names stood out to him: David and Mike. There was something oddly familiar about them, as if he'd seen those names somewhere before. The landlady noticed him staring and felt amazed for him recognizing those names. Billy furrowed his brow, saying he saw David's name in the newspaper and asking if he's either a movie star or an athlete. The landlady laughed dismissively, telling him he must be mistaken. As they sat together, something clicked in Billy's mind. He said David was his classmate and he studied Western economics at his university. The landlady's expression didn't change, but her tone turned condescending. She pointed out he was mistaken again. The David who stayed here was a 17-year-old student at Cambridge. Same name, but not the same person. Billy nodded uncertainly, sipping his tea. He muttered to himself, marveling at the coincidence. The landlady skillfully steered the conversation in another direction. She asked Billy how old he was, smiling. She guessed he was 18, just a year older than that other David, and he was taller too. Standing up to stretch, Billy noticed a taxidermied parrot on a nearby shelf. He said that was beautiful, pointing to it and asking if the landlady made it herself. The landlady didn't answer right away. Before Billy could press her, he suddenly felt lightheaded. His vision blurred and his breath quickened. He staggered back into his chair, clutching at the table for support. He mumbled that he didn't feel well and he thought he just needed to sleep. The landlady hurried over to him, putting a supportive arm around his shoulders. She thought he must be exhausted and offered to take him back to his room. What Billy didn't realize was that the tea had been drugged. Once back in his room, Billy struggled to stay conscious. He crawled toward the window, desperate for fresh air, but his strength gave out. He collapsed in the corner of the room and blacked out. As the pieces fell into place, it became clear. The stranger at the train station and the landlady were working together. Billy hadn't been mistaken. David and Mike were indeed his classmates. The truth revealed itself as the landlady's sinister plan unfolded. She stripped Billy of his clothes and placed him neatly on the bed. Then she opened the door to the adjoining room, revealing her dark secret. Inside were the preserved, life-sized figures of David and Mike, posed like mannequins. The landlady, apparently obsessed with young male bodies, had turned them into lifeless dolls. She walked into the room and spoke to the figures as if they were alive, greeting them warmly and even kissing them on the cheeks. Then she closed the door behind her, grabbed her tools, and wheeled a small cart into Billy's room. It was clear what her intentions were. Billy was about to become her next sex doll. The sixth story begins with the lady of the house, Miss Turton, storming downstairs fuming and immediately beginning berating her husband, Mr. Turton. She demanded to know why he would bring a container train engine here and unload it in front of our house, and if he was out of his mind. Mr. Turton, looking somewhat helpless, explained, "It's an art piece." Miss Turton scoffed that he would better get rid of it before the guests arrive because it's so embarrassing. With that, she spun around, swaying her hips as she climbed back upstairs. Looking at the size of Mr. Turton's yard, it was clear this was the home of someone very wealthy, a sprawling estate befitting a rich family. Not long after, the invited guests began arriving at Mr. Turton's mansion. Jelks, a rather overbearing guest, confidently pulled his car right up to the front door of the luxurious house, leaving it to the butler to park. Meanwhile, John, a young artist, arrived as well, but hesitated to drive in, thinking it would be rude. Standing outside for a while, John noticed Mr. Turton busy overseeing the installation of the art piece and decided to climb over a low wall to join him. He wanted to witness the first moments of this peculiar plank-like sculpture being set up. Once the workers had it in place, Mr. Turton eagerly asked for John's opinion. John said it's quite nice and it feels very sophisticated. Mr. Turton beamed with pride, saying he spent tens of thousands on this, including shipping. John studied the strange sculpture. Its design was confusing and there was an inexplicable hole in the middle. Jokingly, John wondered if it was meant for someone to get stuck in while someone else could perform some hormone yoga session from behind. Later, everyone moved inside. Miss Turton played the role of the perfect hostess, warmly greeting the guests. In total, there were only 3 of them: Jelks, the young artist John, and a female writer who had also been invited. The evening unfolded as expected, eating, drinking, and small talk. But something felt off. The way Miss Turton and Jelks exchanged lingering glances hinted that there was more going on between them. Were they planning something? It turns out that wasn't Miss Turton's only agenda for the night. When dinner began, Miss Turton strategically seated herself next to John. As they chatted, she slipped off her shoe and started gently stroking John's leg with her stinky foot under the table. Her movements were so smooth and practiced, it was clear this wasn't her first time doing something like this. As the meal continued, the butler entered to inform them there had been a minor issue in the kitchen that needed attention. While Mr. Turton left to deal with it, Miss Turton took the opportunity to complain to the guests, saying she always had to handle everything herself. Mr. Turton's so slow, he eats like a snail. Mr. Turton, overhearing her as he returned, simply glanced at her without saying a word. With the guests watching, he decided it was best to let her have her moment and didn't respond. After dinner, the group moved on to playing cards. Miss Turton kept picking on Mr. Turton, teasing him for his low energy. It's just a little money. He had only lost a few rounds. If he was so grumpy about it, he should go to bed early and let the lady writer take his place instead. Mr. Turton endured her jabs silently. Once the card game ended, everyone retired to their respective rooms. In the middle of the night, John was awakened by a strange noise. Turning on the light, he saw Miss Turton standing at the foot of his bed, her intentions as clear as day. She boldly climbed onto the bed and sat beside him, ready to seduce him using her old body. At this point, it's worth noting something about Miss Turton's tactics. If you're a woman and thinking about cheating, take notes. Step 1 is to berate your husband. That way, while he's busy wondering what's wrong with him, you'll have time to focus on someone else. During dinner, John had already noticed Miss Turton's flirtatious energy. Now, as she touched his chest and played with his chest hair, the sparks between them turned into full-blown flames. Miss Turton made the first move, kissing him passionately. Turning off the light, the two began an affair right there in his room. Just as things started heating up, the door suddenly swung open and the butler burst in, shining a flashlight directly at them. Normally, you'd expect Miss Turton to take charge as the lady of the house, telling the butler to leave so she and John could continue. But to everyone's surprise, the butler refused to go. He found an excuse to stay, lingering awkwardly in the room. Perhaps the butler was worried about Mr. Turton finding out and causing a scene. After all, if the affair were exposed, things could spiral out of control. Miss Turton, frustrated but understanding the butler's intentions, cursed under her breath and stormed back to her own room. The next morning, after breakfast, Mr. Turton invited John for a stroll in the garden. They wandered through the yard, chatting casually about art before sitting down at a gazebo. From where they were seated, Mr. Turton had a clear view of his wife and Jelks. The two were by the large plank-like art installation, playfully messing around, their flirtation becoming increasingly obvious. Jelks was busy snapping photos while Miss Turton struck dramatic poses in front of the sculpture. John, noticing the commotion, asked Mr. Turton if they should go join them. Mr. Turton waved him off, saying they were fine here. Meanwhile, Miss Turton and Jelks's antics escalated. Laughing, Miss Turton wedged her head into the hole in the plank sculpture, striking a bold pose for the camera. Jelks eagerly captured the moment, and when he was done, he walked over to show Miss Turton the shots. But instead of simply sharing the photos, he leaned in and forcefully tongue massaged her. From the gazebo, Mr. Turton witnessed the scene, his face growing dark with jealousy. His expression practically turned green with rage. But the situation took a sudden turn when Miss Turton, trying to pull her head back out of the sculpture, realized she was stuck. She struggled to free herself, but found that her head wouldn't budge. Jelks initially thought she was joking and told her not to mess around. But as her tone grew more desperate, Jelks finally took her seriously. He tried everything, removing her jacket, carefully supporting her body, but no matter what he did, her head wouldn't come free. Seeing the commotion, Mr. Turton and John walked over. Despite the serious situation, Mr. Turton couldn't help but look mildly entertained, as though he were watching the drama unfold for his own amusement. The butler arrived with some lubricant, which Mr. Turton smeared generously around Miss Turton's neck and the edge of the sculpture. He told her not to worry, and he would get her out of there, though his actions were clumsy and less than delicate. The strong smell of the lubricant made Miss Turton gag. She complained about the foul smell and demanded to know if Mr. Turton was humiliating her on purpose. Meanwhile, the gardener and 2 children, who had been watching the whole fiasco from a nearby tree, couldn't stop laughing. Unfortunately, the lubricant didn't work, and Miss Turton's head remained firmly stuck. Mr. Turton then asked Jelks to help him, suggesting they pull together and try bending her head out. The 2 men gave it a few tries, but it was no use. Even the gardener and the kids joined in, lifting Miss Turton to various angles to find the best position to free her, but nothing worked. Left with no other option, Mr. Turton finally declared that they would have to destroy the sculpture to save her. The butler returned with an axe and a saw. Just as everyone braced for action, a shocking twist came to light. It turned out Mr. Turton had purchased the sculpture on purpose. He had known all along that Miss Turton's outgoing, playful personality and her tendency to get overly involved in everything would lead to her getting stuck. After years of enduring her flirtations, her endless chatter, and her antics, Mr. Turton had finally had enough. In front of everyone, Mr. Turton suddenly grabbed the axe and, with a furious swing, brought it down. Miss Turton let out a blood-curdling scream before she was dragged away to hell. The 7th story begins with Edward and his wife Louisa living a quiet, relaxed retirement. One morning, while tidying up their front yard, Louisa spotted a stray kitten wandering nearby. A lover of animals, she couldn't resist picking up the tiny creature. But the kitten wriggled free and darted off. As the couple turned to head back inside, the kitten suddenly reappeared, running after them. Edward wanted the cat to go back home since they didn't need it hanging around. He turned to Louisa, telling her not to even think about bringing it in. Cats are messy, and he doesn't want the house in chaos. Half arguing, Louisa glanced at the kitten. The 2 went back inside, leaving the kitten outside. That afternoon, Louisa finished organizing her sheet music and felt a strange sensation, as though something else was in the room. She turned around and, to her surprise, saw the kitten lying comfortably on the couch, tail swishing lazily. Louisa said it was full of surprises, smiling. She wondered if it sneaked in here because it was meant to stay with her. She sat down next to the kitten, her heart melting at its cuteness. Brimming with affection, Louisa decided to play some music for her furry visitor. She started with a soft, gentle tune. The kitten, as if enchanted by the melody, meowed in response. Intrigued, Louisa decided to test its reaction to other musical styles. When she played a faster, more upbeat rhythm, the kitten perked up, leapt onto the table, and began purring loudly as if to express its delight. The little creature's charm was undeniable. It seemed that this kitten had found its new home after all. After the music ended, Louisa muttered to herself that if they should try a piece by Franz Liszt. But it seemed the cat wasn't too keen this time. It jumped down and landed on the windowsill of the small room. Louisa had only played for a few seconds before the cat, in a fit of agitation, knocked over the Liszt sculpture. Hearing the noise, Louisa stood up and froze in shock. She quickly went outside to call Edward in. Once inside, Edward asked if she was still keeping the cat. Louisa explained that it had come in on its own, and this cat had a musical gift. A series of incredible things just happened. Sitting down, Edward was a little dismissive. Louisa couldn't explain it well, so she decided to play another piece to prove her point. Unfortunately, this time the cat didn't do anything destructive. Edward raised an eyebrow, wondering if that's the case. Why isn't it performing now? Louisa replied that cats can't just perform like humans. She has to slowly unlock their potential, then they'll respond to the music. Edward, unimpressed by her flowery words, shot back and asked her to prove it to him. Determined, Louisa went to the library and asked a professor if he could tell her more about the composer Franz Liszt. Though the professor didn't know much about Liszt, hearing him talk about other famous figures gave Louisa some ideas. When she got home, she grabbed the Liszt book and, in a slightly delirious state, began explaining that this fat cat is the reincarnation of Liszt. She asked Edward to feel its face. It looks just like Liszt's. Half believing, Edward hesitantly touched the cat's face, but it just felt plump and ordinary. Louisa insisted that composers are always chubby when they're little. She sat down at the piano and started playing again, hoping to encourage the cat to do something. When the cat jumped off the couch, ran into the other room, and then back onto the couch, Edward couldn't hold back his skepticism, saying, "It's just nonsense." Edward walked over and bluntly said, "It's pointless to try to prove this cat has any talent." His frustration was clear, and he told her to go cook something since they were starving. Louisa, feeling a little guilty for not proving the cat's musical talent, sighed. She told the cat they would meet again later before heading to the kitchen. After a while, she returned to check on the cat, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as she searched the house. No sign of the cat. She went back to the kitchen and asked Edward if he had seen the cat. Somewhat evasive, Edward said he hadn't seen it, but Louisa noticed bloodstains on his hands and what looked like scratch marks. Edward explained he forgot to wear gloves while picking vegetables, and he scratched himself. Louisa didn't fully believe his bullshit. She started to suspect that Edward had done something to the cat, and fury surged through her. Without thinking, she grabbed a knife. Despite Edward shouting for her to put it down, Louisa, in a fit of rage, stabbed him. It was a tragic, impulsive act. Then the cat reappeared, slipping back through the window. Looking back at the situation, it seemed likely that Edward had indeed scratched his hand while picking vegetables, or perhaps when he was handling the cat earlier, he had inadvertently hurt himself. The truth, however, had become clouded in a storm of emotions. The 8th story begins with Bob, a gambler, who was on a luxury cruise ship traveling from the United States to Europe. The journey was long, so the ship's captain decided to host an internal betting game for the passengers. Bob was interested in joining, but wasn't sure about the rules, so he took out a notebook to jot down some notes. As he overheard 2 other passengers complaining about the possibility of an extreme storm that night, which dampened the mood a bit, Bob made a note of it and then approached a crew member. He slipped the person a tip and managed to secure a good spot for dinner with the ship's manager. Even though Bob was sitting across from the manager during the meal, when he jokingly asked what the pool bet was about, the manager remained silent and unresponsive. A man seated nearby overheard and decided to explain, saying, "That's not a pool, it's called an option pool, or more like a cumulative prize pool." He went on to explain that since the cruise was so long, the captain had made an assessment of how far the ship would travel in 24 hours. For example, if the captain estimated that the ship would cover 600 kilometers that day, passengers could bet on whether the captain's estimate would be too high or too low. No one had been able to predict it correctly in the past few days, so the prize pool had grown to 12,000. Just after the man finished explaining, the ship was hit by the storm, causing it to lose balance and rock wildly. Most of the passengers at dinner felt dizzy and lost their appetite, so they left the dining room. But Bob was more excited than ever. After confirming the details of the betting game with the manager, he made his way to the auction. On the surface, the auctioneer was presenting the price of a certain item, but everyone knew it was essentially a bidding war for the captain's betting game. As luck would have it, the auction item for the day was low field, meaning the captain had overestimated the distance the ship would travel in 24 hours. With the extreme weather, it was likely that the ship would fall short of the captain's predicted distance. For example, if the captain had estimated 600 kilometers, the storm could reduce the actual distance to only 500 kilometers, meaning the captain would lose. Whoever won the bid would get the entire prize pool. The auction was heating up, with bidders calling out prices. The bids kept rising, and Bob, feeling both nervous and excited, knew that the highest bid could go up to 1,000. When the bidding reached between 900 and 1,000, Bob couldn't resist any longer. He jumped up and shouted 1,000. The moment he did, everyone else fell silent. The highest bid had been set. The auctioneer announced congratulations, and the room erupted in applause. Bob had won the bid, but that 1,000 was all the money he had. Of that, 800 was meant to be given to his wife once they reached Europe. This was, without a doubt, Bob's last gamble. As the auction ended and Bob stepped outside, he took a moment to look at the stormy weather. With the wind howling, he thought to himself that there's no way the ship would reach the captain's predicted distance in the next 24 hours. So he had got this in the bag. In the blink of an eye, Bob woke up, the clock showing it was already the next morning. Why was it so quiet? Something felt off. What about the extreme weather they had talked about? He quickly turned on the light, got out of bed, and pulled back the curtains. To his surprise, he couldn't tell when the weather had changed, but outside, the calm sea had returned, and the wind had died down. A waiter came in to deliver breakfast, and what he said left Bob stunned. The waiter casually mentioned that the weather had cleared up hours ago, and now the captain was speeding up to make up for the lost time. Bob looked at his watch. It was only 9 a.m. If the captain was speeding up now, he'd probably make up for the lost distance, meaning Bob would lose the bet. And that 1,000 was all he had, his entire savings. After a moment of panic, Bob grabbed the slip from the auction and went to speak with the ship's manager. There were just a few hours left until noon, and Bob wondered if there was any way to slow the ship down. The manager replied nonchalantly that if they had another storm like last night that lasted an hour or so, the ship's distance would definitely be delayed. As Bob stepped back out onto the deck, looking at the busy crew members, an idea, albeit a bad one, suddenly hit him. He thought, what if he could make the storm happen himself? If he jumps off the ship, they'll have to stop and rescue him. That would buy enough time for the distance to fall short. He could still win this. With time running out, Bob noticed an elderly woman standing by the railing, admiring the sea view. He realized he couldn't hesitate any longer. He walked over to her and greeted her warmly, repeating his name 3 times to make sure she remembered it. That way, if things went south, she could help call for help. After a brief chat, Bob moved aside, glanced down at the water below, and made sure the woman could see him. He hesitated for only a moment before climbing over the railing and leaping into the water. Once he surfaced, Bob screamed for help at the top of his lungs. However, the dramatic twist came when the elderly woman, though clearly shocked, made no move to help. She just thought maybe the man wanted to take a bath in the sea. In fact, she even waved at him as the ship sailed further away. Bob's cries for help went unheard as the ship continued its course. A few moments later, a nurse walked by and told the elderly woman that they had been looking everywhere for her and wondered why she was hiding here. The woman, still somewhat confused, explained what had just happened. She said a man just jumped into the sea to take a bath. He even kept repeating his name 3 times. He's definitely not right in the head. The nurse, raising an eyebrow, asked if she was seeing hallucinations again. Next time, when she comes out to see the view, she should call her. As the two walked back, the elderly woman continued to chatter that the man seemed to be flirting with her. He was saying his name over and over, and he was definitely trying to get her attention. The 9th story begins with a woman, Mrs. Foster, who was extremely anxious and sensitive about time. No matter what she was doing, even if she had plenty of time, she couldn't help but feel tense and anxious whenever she saw the second hand of a clock ticking. She always had this nagging feeling that she was running late. The housekeeper was used to it. Sometimes, every few seconds, Mrs. Foster would ask what time it was now, and the housekeeper would check her watch, give the time, and tell her not to worry since she had got plenty of time. The funny thing was, this time-obsessed Mrs. Foster was married to a husband who was the complete opposite and was never in a rush, always slow and laid back. How do you describe Mr. Foster? Well, if the company's workday started at 8:30 a.m., Mr. Foster would definitely be the one walking in at 8:29. If you said you wanted to be in the bedroom for intimacy at 9 p.m., Mr. Foster would stroll in at 8:59. If they needed to leave at 4:20 p.m. to go to the office and drop Mrs. Foster off at the airport, Mr. Foster would still be taking his time, leaving at 4:15, washing his hands and probably getting distracted by something else. Mrs. Foster, already exhausted by his constant delay, would grab her bag and go wait in the car. Luckily, Mr. Foster did stick to the plan that day, getting into the car around 4:20. This kind of dynamic wasn't new to them. It had been going on for a while, and Mr. Foster was just as fed up with Mrs. Foster's constant stress about time. Sitting in the car, Mrs. Foster was staring anxiously out the window while Mr. Foster, holding a cigar, finally told her not to make the atmosphere so tense. Thankfully, there was no traffic, and when they arrived, the driver had some good news for Mrs. Foster that her flight has been delayed. It's not taking off until after 6 o'clock, so she had an extra hour. Mrs. Foster, relieved, was headed to New York for a month-long vacation, not just to visit the kids, but also to unwind and relax. After a quick kiss goodbye to Mr. Foster, Mrs. Foster entered the airport terminal. There were drinks everywhere and everything was free. Since she had time to kill, Mrs. Foster ordered a juice from the bar and started chatting with the bartender about why she was so obsessed with time. Mrs. Foster explained that her father, a military officer, was extremely strict with her when she was a child. He even imposed strict meal times, and if she didn't finish in time, she would get a spanking. Deep down, Mrs. Foster knew that she was usually fine with the time. time, but she just couldn't control the physical tension that came with it. The bartender listened politely, nodding as she went about her business. Just then, the phone rang, and the bartender answered with a few yes responses. Hanging up, the bartender walked to the center and announced to everyone that due to weather conditions, tonight's flight has been canceled. It's been rescheduled for 11 a.m. tomorrow. If anyone needs to rebook, please come to the desk. Hearing this, Mrs. Foster quickly called her husband to pass on the information. After a lot of back and forth, she eventually made her way back home, telling Mr. Foster all about the situation. She said the hotel was fully booked, so she would have to stay here. Mr. Foster, clearly getting irritated, responded that since the flight tomorrow was at 11 a.m., he would arrange for a 9 a.m. driver to take them. He would stop by the bank on the way, though. Mrs. Foster's anxiety spiked again since the bank is in the opposite direction and she needs to be at the airport by 10 a.m. Mr. Foster tried to reassure her that she would have plenty of time. With that, they went upstairs to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Foster woke up and glanced at the clock. It was already 9 a.m. Her anxiety went into overdrive again. As she saw Mr. Foster casually stepping out of the elevator, she quickened her pace and urged him to go since the car was outside. Mr. Foster, unhurried, said he would be right there after having a smoke. Seeing that her husband was once again dawdling, Mrs. Foster decided to wait in the car. By 9:10 a.m., she finally saw Mr. Foster getting into the car. Mrs. Foster quickly urged the driver to start. Just as the car was about to pull away, Mr. Foster realized he had forgotten the gift box, the one he was supposed to give to the bank manager today. He insisted the gift had to be with him before they could leave. Mrs. Foster, on the verge of tears, begged him to hurry, saying they were going to be late. But Mr. Foster just opened the door, muttering about the urgency of the situation, and got out of the car to go back inside. Now frustrated, Mrs. Foster felt something hard under her hand on the seat. She touched it and realized this was the gold bar he was going to give to the bank manager. She quickly instructed the driver to tell Mr. Foster that the gift had been found. The driver got out, tried the door, but came back and reported that it's locked and he can't get in without the key. Mrs. Foster glanced at the door and said she would do it. She hurried to the door, and just as she was about to grab the key, she heard Mr. Foster's faint voice from inside, telling her to help him since he was in the elevator. Hearing the panic in his voice, Mrs. Foster immediately knew that her husband was either having an episode or had forgotten his medication again. At that moment, Mrs. Foster felt something shift within her. She saw an opportunity, and she made a decision. She pretended not to hear him. Stepping back, she told the driver she was going to be late and they should go now. As the car pulled away, Mrs. Foster couldn't help but feel a thrill of satisfaction. After all, Mr. Foster's constant procrastination was his own doing. Since Mrs. Foster was headed to New York, the housekeeper and servants had been given an extended vacation. Everything went as planned, and Mrs. Foster made it to the airport and then to New York without a hitch. As agreed, Mrs. Foster wrote her husband a letter every week. A month and a half later, Mrs. Foster, with her luggage, returned home. When she opened the door and saw the pile of letters on the floor, she wasn't surprised. Mrs. Foster had suspected that she hadn't saved her husband that day and that he probably had passed away in the elevator. She glanced over at the elevator and immediately picked up the phone to call the elevator company, asking them to send someone over to fix the elevator. It seems to be stuck between the first and second floors. She just got home and doesn't know what happened. It was clear Mrs. Foster had already prepared a series of reasons to clear herself of any suspicion. The scene shifted to the elevator, where Mr. Foster was found dead, already gone. It was a simple yet chilling story with a dark, twisted turn. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.